Dr. Ayanna Morgan, a black neurosurgeon, moves to a small town to save its struggling clinic, only to face relentless racism and corruption. The town's corrupt sheriff, backed by a prejudiced council, launches a smear campaign to sabotage her efforts, accusing her of fraud and orchestrating her public humiliation. As Ayanna uncovers a web of systemic injustice, stolen public funds, and abuse of power, she must navigate the infuriating resistance of a community entrenched in racism. This story exposes the harsh realities of prejudice and the infuriating obstacles faced by those fighting for justice in America. The courtroom was silent, heavy with the weight of unspoken tension. At the center of it all stood Monica Taylor, a single mother of two, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the defendant's table across from her. The prosecutor smirked, his confidence unshaken despite the glaring inconsistencies in the case. "Monica Taylor," Judge Richard Lawson began, his voice cold and unyielding, "for the charges of embezzlement and fraud, I sentence you to 25 years in state prison." The room erupted. Monica's eldest son, Jamal, barely 15, cried out, "No, she didn't do it!" His younger sister clung to their grandmother, sobbing as Monica's knees buckled. The judge's gavel slammed down, silencing the chaos, but Monica's world was already shattered. For Monica, this wasn't just about losing her freedom, it was about losing the ability to protect her children. But what the courtroom didn't know, what Judge Lawson could never have predicted, was that Monica Taylor wasn't about to let an unjust system define her life. Before we dive into the twists and turns of Monica's incredible fight for justice, let's step back to understand how she ended up here. A journey filled with heartbreak, resilience, and the unshakable belief that truth always finds a way. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Blackstone's bistro, casting a warm glow over the neatly arranged tables. It was a modest diner tucked away in the heart of Millbrook, a small town that prided itself on its old-fashioned charm. The air carried the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee, mingled with the faint scent of buttery pancakes and sizzling bacon. The place was lively, filled with a mix of locals chatting about the latest town gossip and tourists passing through. Sitting at a corner table, unassuming yet unmistakable, was Dr. Ayanna Morgan. She wore a crisp white blouse, its simplicity belying its fine tailoring, and dark jeans that fit her form perfectly but practically. Her locks, neatly tied back, fell to her shoulders, framing a face of quiet determination and warmth. At 42, Ayanna was one of the most successful neurosurgeons in the country and the CEO of Morgan Health Initiatives, a nonprofit she founded to bring affordable healthcare to underserved communities. Despite her accolades, she preferred spaces like this, a simple diner with a homey feel. Her wealth was evident only in the subtle details: the leather briefcase beside her chair, the glint of a slim gold bracelet on her wrist, and the way she carried herself, with quiet confidence rather than ostentation. Ayanna had come to Millbrook with a mission. The town's only clinic was on the verge of closure, and she intended to save it. For months, she had been in talks with local officials, hoping to secure funding to transform the clinic into a state-of-the-art community health center. But progress had been slow. Too slow. The town's leadership seemed reluctant to embrace her vision, and the whispers of prejudice, though subtle, were unmistakable. She glanced at her watch. She had 10 minutes before her meeting with Mayor Harrington and the town council. Absently, she sipped her coffee, letting her mind drift to the events of the morning. The day had started early, as most of her days did. By 6, she had been on a video call with her board of directors, discussing the logistics of opening 2 new mobile clinics in neighboring states. By 7, she was reviewing patient data from a recent outreach program in the city. But by 8, she had traded her office's polished glass walls for the rustic charm of Millbrook, determined to make headway on the clinic project. Millbrook was beautiful, no doubt about it. Lush green hills rolled into the horizon, and the town's historic Main Street looked like a postcard, with its brick-paved sidewalks and brightly painted storefronts. Yet beneath the charm lay an undercurrent of resistance, a reluctance to change, particularly when that change came from an outsider. The bell over the diner door jingled, pulling Ayanna from her thoughts. A man in his mid-50s entered, dressed in a plaid shirt and faded jeans. He paused, scanning the room, before his eyes landed on her. "Ayanna Morgan?" he asked, approaching her table with a cautious smile. "Yes," she replied, standing and extending her hand. "I'm Greg Hayes, from the town council Nice, to finally meet you in person." "Likewise," she said warmly, though she noted the hesitation in his handshake, the slight faltering of his gaze, as he took her in. It was subtle, but Ayanna had learned to recognize it over the years. The unspoken question in his eyes wasn't unfamiliar. What's someone like her doing here? Greg gestured toward the seat across from her. "Do you mind if we chat before the meeting, just a quick word?" "Of course." Ayanna gestured for him to sit, signaling the waitress for another coffee. As they settled in, Greg leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Dr. Morgan, I want to be honest with you. What you're proposing is ambitious. Transforming the clinic is no small task, and there's been some concern among the council members about whether it's the right fit for Millbrook." Ayanna smiled politely, though her patience was already wearing thin. "I understand change can be daunting, Mr. Hayes. But the clinic is on the brink of closure. If we don't act now, hundreds of residents will be left without access to basic healthcare. This isn't just about ambition, it's about necessity." Greg nodded slowly, but his expression remained guarded. "I hear you, and I'm sure your heart's in the right place. It's just, Millbrook's a close-knit community. Folks here are used to doing things their way. There's some concern about outside influence, you know?" There it was, outside influence. The euphemism for what they really meant. Ayanna had encountered it before, in other towns and cities. The polite deflections, the coded language that barely masked the discomfort with someone like her, a powerful black woman, stepping into their world with bold ideas and unshakable determination. "I understand your concerns," Ayanna said evenly, keeping her tone measured. "But I'm not here to disrupt your community. I'm here to enhance it, to ensure that every family in Millbrook has access to the care they deserve. Isn't that a goal we all share?" Greg opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, a commotion erupted near the counter. Ayanna turned her head toward the source of the noise. A young waitress, no older than 20, stood frozen, a tray of plates balanced precariously in her hands. Across from her, a man in a crisp suit leaned against the counter, his voice sharp and condescending. "Do you even know how to take an order properly?" the man snapped, his tone loud enough to draw the attention of the entire diner. "I asked for eggs over easy. These are scrambled. Are you incapable of doing your job?" The waitress stammered an apology, her cheeks flushing bright red. "I'm so sorry, sir, I'll fix it right away." "You'd better," the man sneered, shoving the plate toward her with enough force that it clattered against the counter. Ayanna's jaw tightened. She'd seen this kind of behavior before, the entitlement, the casual cruelty. Her eyes flicked to Greg, who avoided her gaze, pretending not to notice the scene. Before Ayanna could think better of it, she stood and approached the counter. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. The man turned to her, his expression shifting from annoyance to surprise. "What?" "There's no need to speak to her like that," Ayanna continued, her gaze steady. "Mistakes happen. She's doing her best." The man's surprise quickly turned to irritation. "And who are you to tell me how to speak to anyone?" Ayanna's posture remained relaxed, but her voice carried an unmistakable authority. "Just someone who believes in treating people with respect." The man scoffed, his eyes scanning her as if sizing her up. Figure's always someone looking to stick their nose where it doesn't belong. Ayanna didn't flinch. She simply held his gaze, letting the silence speak for itself. Finally, the man huffed and threw a few bills on the counter before storming out of the diner. As the door slammed shut, the waitress murmured a soft, "Thank you," her voice barely audible over the renewed hum of conversation. Ayanna nodded, offering a reassuring smile before returning to her table. Greg stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said after a moment, "that was something." "It was the right thing to do," Ayanna replied simply, picking up her coffee again. Greg said nothing more, but Ayanna could feel the shift in the air between them. She knew what he was thinking, even if he didn't say it aloud. She's not just another outsider, she's not afraid to stand her ground. This quiet act of defiance was just the beginning. Ayanna didn't come to Millbrook to be overlooked or dismissed, she came to fight for what was right. And if the morning's events were any indication, that fight was already beginning to take shape. Ayanna stood outside the town hall, her reflection faintly visible in the polished glass doors. The building was an imposing structure for such a small town, its white stone exterior gleaming under the midday sun. She smoothed her blouse and took a deep breath. Meetings like these never got easier, no matter how many she'd attended in her career. Inside, the hallway was quiet, the sound of her heels clicking against the tiled floor. A receptionist directed her to the conference room, where the town council was gathered. As Ayanna approached, muffled voices leaked through the heavy oak door, their tones hushed but sharp. She knocked twice, then pushed the door open. The room was modest but functional, with a long table at its center and windows overlooking the town square. 5 members of the council sat around the table, their expressions ranging from polite interest to guarded skepticism. Mayor Harrington, a portly man in his 60s with thinning gray hair, sat at the head of the table. He smiled thinly as Ayanna entered. "Dr. Morgan, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to an empty chair near him. "We were just discussing your proposal." "Thank you for having me," Ayanna replied, taking her seat and placing her briefcase beside her. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging. It wasn't new to her, but it still stung every time. "We appreciate your enthusiasm for our little town," Harrington began, his voice oozing a practiced charm. "But as Mr. Hayes may have mentioned, there's been some concern about the feasibility of your project." "Concern?" Ayanna repeated, keeping her tone neutral. "Yes," said another council member, a woman with sharp features and a pinched expression. "We've reviewed your proposal, and while it's impressive, it might be ambitious for a town like Millbrook." Ayanna offered a measured smile. "Ambitious goals often lead to the greatest results. I've seen it firsthand in other communities where we've implemented similar programs. The benefits are undeniable: improved health outcomes, job creation, and a stronger sense of community." "That may be true in larger cities," said a man sitting across from her, his arms crossed tightly. His nameplate read, "Councilman Mitchell Farnsworth." "But Millbrook isn't a city. We have traditions, ways of doing things. Outsiders don't always understand what works here." Ayanna's smile faltered slightly. Outsider. There it was again. The unspoken barrier they were so keen to erect. She could feel the weight of their bias pressing against her, but she refused to let it show. "I assure you, Councilman Farnsworth," she said evenly, "I've taken the unique needs of Millbrook into account. My team and I have tailored this proposal specifically for your community, with input from local residents and medical professionals." Farnsworth raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "And yet, you've never lived here. How can you truly understand what's best for us?" Before Ayanna could respond, the door opened abruptly, and a tall man in a sheriff's uniform stepped in. His badge caught the light as he sauntered to the mayor's side. "Sorry to interrupt," he drawled, though his tone carried no real apology. "Just wanted to see what all the fuss was about." "This is Sheriff Daniels," Harrington said, motioning to the man. "He's been a pillar of this community for years." Daniels looked Ayanna up and down, his eyes lingering a fraction too long before he extended a hand. "Pleasure to meet you, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Ayanna shook his hand, her grip firm. "Likewise, Sheriff." "Gotta say, I'm curious," Daniels continued, pulling out a chair and sitting uninvited. "You're from the city, right? Must be quite the change, coming out here to our little corner of the world." "It's different. But I've always believed that change can start in the smallest places," Ayanna replied, her words carefully chosen. Daniels chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Ambitious words, but you might find folks here aren't so eager for outsiders to tell them how to run their lives." Ayanna's jaw tightened. She kept her expression calm, but inside, frustration simmered. Every word, every glance, felt like a test, a reminder that no matter her qualifications, her presence here was being scrutinized through a lens of prejudice. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steady, "I'm not here to tell anyone how to live. I'm here to collaborate, to bring resources and opportunities that can benefit this community." Daniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, we'll see about that." The meeting dragged on. Each minute feeling heavier than the last, Ayanna presented her case with poise, outlining the benefits of the proposed health center. But every point was met with thinly veiled resistance. Farnsworth questioned her funding sources. The sharp-featured woman doubted the project's sustainability, and Daniels interjected with anecdotes about the town's unique culture, none of which seemed relevant, but all of which served to undermine Ayanna's authority. By the time the meeting ended, Ayanna felt drained. The mayor thanked her for her time, with the same hollow politeness he'd used when she arrived, and the council members filed out, their murmurs just loud enough for her to catch snippets. Too idealistic. Doesn't understand our town. A lot of talk, but no real substance. Ayanna gathered her belongings, her movements precise and controlled. She wouldn't let them see her frustration, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of thinking they'd shaken her. As she exited the building, the crisp afternoon air felt like a reprieve, though it did little to lift the weight pressing on her chest. She was halfway to her car when she heard a voice behind her. "Dr. Morgan?" She turned to see Sheriff Daniels approaching, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. His demeanor was friendly, almost too friendly, and Ayanna felt her guard go up. "Yes, Sheriff," she said, her tone polite but distant. "Just wanted to say, it's admirable what you're trying to do," he began, stopping a few feet away. "But you might want to be careful. Small towns like this, they don't always take kindly to folks stirring the pot." Ayanna met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "I'm not here to stir the pot, Sheriff. I'm here to help." "Of course," he said with a smirk. "Just thought you should know how things work around here. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Is that advice or a warning?" Daniels chuckled, his teeth flashing in a wolfish grin. "Take it however you like." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Ayanna standing alone in the parking lot, her heart pounding. That evening, Ayanna returned to her temporary office in the town's library, a small room she'd been using to coordinate her efforts. She sat at her desk, staring at the documents spread before her. The day's events replayed in her mind, each interaction replaying with sharp clarity. She felt the anger rise again, the patronizing tone of the council members, the sheriff's veiled threat, the constant insinuation that she didn't belong here. But beneath the anger was something deeper, a determination that had carried her through every challenge she'd faced in her life. She pulled out her notebook and began writing, jotting down her thoughts, strategies, and the names of people she needed to contact. If the council and the sheriff thought she would back down, they were sorely mistaken. Ayanna Morgan wasn't just fighting for a clinic, she was fighting for the people of Millbrook, for the families who deserved better than what the system had given them, and she wasn't about to let a few narrow-minded officials stand in her way. The diner was packed, a rare sight for the sleepy midweek evening in Millbrook. Ayanna sat near the window, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea, while her laptop glowed faintly on the table. She had spent the afternoon refining her proposal, tweaking the language to address the council's concerns, though she doubted it would make much difference. The fight ahead wasn't about numbers or logistics, it was about breaking through the walls of bias that had been built long before she arrived. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the screen. It was a text from her assistant in the city. "Got a tip from a source? Might want to check tonight's council minutes. Strange movements. Be careful." Ayanna frowned. She'd already left the meeting hours ago. What could they be discussing now? Her instincts told her to dig deeper. She began searching for updates online, but before she could find anything, the bell over the diner door jingled. Sheriff Daniels entered, his presence drawing the attention of nearly everyone in the room. He was flanked by two deputies, their faces hard and expressionless. Ayanna felt a flicker of unease as his gaze locked onto hers. She straightened in her seat, refusing to let him see any hint of discomfort. Daniels approached her table with deliberate slowness, the room quieting as murmurs spread through the diners. "Evening, Dr. Morgan," he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to make her wary. "Mind if we have a word?" Ayanna closed her laptop and folded her hands calmly on the table. "Of course, Sheriff. What's this about?" His smirk deepened. "We've received some complaints about irregularities with your project, missing funds, questionable activities. Thought it'd be best to sort it out down at the station." A wave of murmurs swept through the diner. Ayanna's heart pounded, but she kept her composure. She knew this wasn't about funds, it was about intimidation. "I'd be happy to answer any questions you have," she said, her voice steady. "But I assure you, my accounts are in perfect order. If you'd like to review them, I can provide everything you need." Daniels leaned closer, his tone lowering, but dripping with menace. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. We'll need you to come with us for questioning." Ayanna glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of curious onlookers. The message was clear. This wasn't just about her, it was about sending a signal to anyone who dared challenge the status quo in Millbrook. She rose to her feet slowly, leveling her gaze at Daniels. "I'll cooperate, but I want my attorney notified immediately." His grin widened. "That's your right." As the deputies closed in to escort her, she noticed one of them hesitate, his eyes flicking between her and Daniels. It was subtle, but it gave her a sliver of hope that not everyone was on the sheriff's side. The station was a stark contrast to the warmth of the diner. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled faintly of bleach. Ayanna sat alone in a cold interrogation room, her hands resting on the metal table. The walls felt like they were closing in, but she forced herself to stay calm, drawing on the same inner strength that had carried her through countless surgeries and high-stakes board meetings. After what felt like an eternity, Daniels entered, carrying a folder under his arm. He dropped it onto the table with a theatrical thud and sat across from her, his smug expression firmly in place. "Now," he began, "why don't you tell me about the missing money?" Ayanna tilted her head, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. All funds for the project are accounted for, and my team has the documentation to prove it." Daniels opened the folder, pulling out a series of papers. "Funny, because this here says otherwise. A local contractor claims you failed to pay him for services rendered, says you've been dodging his calls." Ayanna's brow furrowed. "That's not possible. Every contractor we've worked with has been paid in full. If there's an issue, it's likely a miscommunication. I'd be happy to resolve it." Daniels leaned back, tapping his pen against the table. "Miscommunication, huh? Seems like there's been a lot of those lately. People in this town don't seem too thrilled about your presence. Makes you wonder if maybe you're in over your head." Her patience snapped, though she kept her tone measured. "Sheriff, let's not pretend this is about contractors or funds. This is about control. You and your allies on the council don't want someone like me, an outsider, a black woman, challenging the way things have always been done here." Daniel's grin faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Careful, Dr. Morgan. That sounds an awful lot like an accusation." "It's the truth," she said firmly, "and you know it." The tension between them was palpable, the air in the room thick with unspoken animosity. Before Daniels could respond, the door opened, and one of the deputies stepped in, looking uneasy. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "you might want to see this." Daniels shot Ayanna a warning glance before rising and following the deputy out. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving her alone once again. Meanwhile, outside the station, a crowd had begun to gather. Word of Ayanna's detainment had spread quickly, and dozens of locals had shown up to voice their support, or their curiosity. Among them was Mitchell Farnsworth, who had heard the news and come out of what he claimed was concern for the town's reputation. Standing on the edge of the crowd, he watched as people argued over Ayanna's character and her motives. Some defended her passionately, citing her efforts to improve the community, while others muttered about her being too ambitious or out of her depth. Mitchell felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't supported Ayanna's project outright, but he also hadn't stood up to Daniels or the other council members. Now, seeing the spectacle unfolding, he realized just how far things had gone. Inside the station, Daniels returned to the interrogation room, his face tight with barely contained frustration. He dropped back into his seat, glaring at Ayanna. "Seems like you've stirred up quite the crowd out there," he said. "Protests and everything. Guess people have a lot of opinions about you." Ayanna allowed herself a small, defiant smile. "Good, it means they're paying attention." Daniels leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't think this is over, Dr. Morgan. You might have gotten the town riled up, but that doesn't mean you're untouchable." "Neither are you, Sheriff," she replied, her calm composure unwavering. The tension crackled between them, but before Daniels could push further, the deputy from earlier returned, this time with a look of urgency. "Sheriff, we've got a problem," he said, glancing at Ayanna before lowering his voice. "There's been a leak. Documents showing irregularities in council contracts. It's all over the news." Daniels stiffened, his face darkening. Without another word, he stormed out, leaving Ayanna alone once more. She exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Whatever had just happened, it was clear the tides were beginning to turn. Outside, the crowd had grown restless. Chants of, "Let her go," echoed through the evening air as Mitchell pushed his way to the front. He spotted Tanya, one of Ayanna's local supporters, holding a clipboard and rallying the group with fiery determination. "Mitchell," she called out, her eyes narrowing. "You finally decided to show up. Care to explain why the council is letting Daniels harass Dr. Morgan?" "I didn't know it would come to this," Mitchell said defensively. Save it," Tanya snapped. "If you're not here to help, step aside, we've got work to do." Mitchell opened his mouth to reply, but stopped when the station doors opened, and Ayanna stepped out, flanked by 2 deputies. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Ayanna raised her hand, signaling for calm. She stood tall, her expression resolute, as she addressed the gathering. "Thank you for your support," she began, her voice steady despite the chaos. "This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. The people of Millbrook who deserve better than what this system has given us. This fight isn't over, and together, we will see it through." The crowd roared in approval, their chants growing louder. As Ayanna descended the steps, Mitchell watched in silence, a deep sense of unease settling over him. For the first time, he realized just how much was at stake, not just for Ayanna, but for the entire town. As Ayanna walked through the crowd, a car screeched to a halt nearby. A man stepped out, holding a stack of documents and waving frantically. "Dr. Morgan!" he called out. "You need to see this. It's about the council." "You were right." Ayanna's heart raced as she reached for the papers, the weight of their contents clear even before she read them. The truth was about to come to light, and it was more explosive than she had imagined. The council's special meeting was held in the cavernous town hall, its high ceilings amplifying every shuffle of paper and murmured conversation. Ayanna sat near the back, the only black face in a room filled with pointed stares and hushed whispers. She kept her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, even as the tension in the room felt like it was closing in on her. On the dais, Mayor Harrington shuffled his notes nervously, while Councilman Farnsworth whispered something to him. Sheriff Daniels stood off to the side, leaning against a wall with his arms crossed, a smug smile tugging at his lips. Ayanna met his gaze briefly, refusing to look away until he broke the stare. The meeting began with mundane agenda items: road maintenance, budget reviews, and zoning permits. Ayanna felt her patience wearing thin as the minutes ticked by. Finally, the mayor cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Our next item concerns the proposed redevelopment of the Millbrook Clinic," Harrington said, glancing at Ayanna briefly before looking away. "There have been concerns raised about the project, including financial discrepancies and community impact. Sheriff Daniels has been kind enough to provide additional context." Daniels straightened, sauntering to the podium with the air of a man who already believed he'd won. He placed a folder on the lectern and began flipping through its contents, speaking in a tone heavy with false concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've conducted a preliminary investigation into Dr. Morgan's proposal," he began, his voice carrying through the hall. "What I've found raises serious questions about her intentions. We've received multiple reports from local contractors claiming they were never paid, as well as allegations that funding sources for this project are unclear at best." Ayanna's jaw tightened. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, their judgment as heavy as the sheriff's words. "These are serious allegations," Daniels continued, his smirk growing. "And as much as we'd like to see improvements to our clinic, we have to ask ourselves, can we really trust someone who comes from outside our community and brings this level of chaos?" Murmurs rippled through the audience, a mixture of agreement and unease. Ayanna's heart pounded, but she kept her expression calm, even as her mind raced. This wasn't just about discrediting her proposal, it was about discrediting her entirely. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Dr. Morgan, would you care to respond?" Ayanna stood, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. As she walked to the podium, the room fell into an expectant hush. Daniels stepped aside, his smirk unwavering, but she ignored him, focusing instead on the faces of the council members and the townspeople. "Thank you, Mayor Harrington," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I've heard the allegations made by Sheriff Daniels, and I can assure you they are unfounded. Every contractor associated with this project has been paid in full, and my team has meticulously documented every transaction. If there are any discrepancies, they are not the result of negligence, but likely an attempt to undermine the progress we're trying to make." A few murmurs of surprise echoed through the room, but Ayanna pressed on. "This project isn't about me. It's about the people of Millbrook, the families who rely on the clinic for basic health care, the children who deserve access to quality services, and the seniors who need support as they age. What we're trying to do here is not chaos. It's compassion." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like the tide might turn. But Daniels wasn't finished. He stepped back to the podium, holding up a sheet of paper. "Well, Dr. Morgan," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, "if everything is as above board as you claim, how do you explain this?" He handed the paper to the mayor, who frowned deeply as he read it. "This is troubling," Harrington muttered, passing it to Farnsworth. The councilman's eyes narrowed as he scanned the document. "What is it?" Ayanna asked, her voice calm but firm. Daniels's grin widened. "A sworn statement from a contractor who claims you threatened legal action to silence his complaints. Care to explain?" Ayanna's stomach churned. She had no idea what Daniels was referring to, but the document, real or fabricated, was clearly part of a coordinated effort to destroy her credibility. "I've never threatened anyone," she said firmly. "This accusation is baseless, and I demand to see that statement." Daniels held the paper aloft, just out of reach. "It'll be available during the investigation." Ayanna clenched her fists, but before she could respond, a voice called out from the back of the room. "This is outrageous!" The crowd turned to see Tanya, a local activist who had been one of Ayanna's earliest supporters. She stood with her arms crossed, her voice ringing with righteous anger. "Sheriff Daniels has been out to get Dr. Morgan since the day she arrived," Tanya said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "This so-called investigation is nothing more than a smear campaign." "Order!" Harrington barked, his gavel striking the table. "Ms. Jenkins, please sit down." "I will not," Tanya shot back. "You all know what's really going on here. You're afraid of change, afraid of a strong black woman coming in and showing you how things should be done." The room erupted into chaos, with voices shouting both in support and against Tanya. Ayanna felt a surge of gratitude for her ally, but also knew that this confrontation was quickly spiraling out of control. "Enough!" Daniels bellowed, slamming his hand on the lectern. "This meeting is over." "No, it's not," Ayanna said, her voice cutting through the noise. She stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Daniels. "You can try to discredit me all you want, but the truth will come out. You may hold power in this town, Sheriff, but you don't hold the truth." Daniels' smirk faltered for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Ayanna turned back to the crowd. "To anyone who has questions about this project or my integrity, my office is open. I'll provide every document, every record, and every answer you need. I'm not afraid of transparency, because I have nothing to hide." The room fell silent, her words landing with undeniable weight. Ayanna met the eyes of each council member before stepping back from the podium. As the crowd dispersed, Ayanna returned to her car, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. She was exhausted but determined. This was no longer just about the clinic, it was about exposing the rot that people like Daniels represented. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email from Rachel Bryant, an investigative journalist she'd contacted weeks ago. The subject line read, "Urgent, evidence uncovered, call ASAP." Ayanna dialed immediately, her heart pounding as Rachel answered on the second ring. "Dr. Morgan?" Rachel said, her tone brisk. "You were right. There's more to this than just bias against your project. I've uncovered financial records tying Sheriff Daniels to several questionable deals with the council. It looks like they've been skimming funds for years." Ayanna's breath caught. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Rachel replied. "I'm sending everything to your email now. This could be the leverage you need." Ayanna's resolve hardened. She didn't just have a fight ahead of her, she had ammunition. As Ayanna ended the call, headlights illuminated her car. A black SUV pulled up behind her, and two men in plain clothes stepped out, their movements deliberate and intimidating. One of them approached her window, tapping on the glass. Dr. Morgan? He asked, his voice low. We need you to come with us. Ayanna's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. Who are you, and what is this about? The man flashed a badge, his expression unreadable. It's about the safety of this town, you need to come with us now. Ayanna sat at the head of a conference table in her makeshift office, the dim glow of her laptop screen reflecting in her eyes. Her inbox was open, the files Rachel Bryant had sent scrolling past. Financial ledgers, email correspondences, and a damning list of transactions tying Sheriff Daniels and several council members to fraudulent activity. Her pulse quickened as she pieced together the extent of their corruption. It wasn't just about sabotaging her project. They were siphoning money meant for public services, schools, infrastructure, and healthcare, into their own pockets. Her resolve solidified. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was the town's. Before she could finish reviewing the documents, her phone buzzed. Rachel's name flashed on the screen. I've sent the files to a trusted contact at the State Attorney General's office, Rachel said without preamble. But if Daniels gets wind of this before they act, he'll do everything he can to bury it. Understood, Ayanna replied. We need to make it public. That's risky, Rachel warned. They'll come after you. They already have, Ayanna said firmly. This ends tonight. Ayanna stepped into the brightly lit town hall, where a late-night emergency meeting had been convened. The air buzzed with tension. Word of her arrest and Daniels' alleged investigation had spread quickly. The room was packed with townspeople, their murmurs rising and falling like the tide. Tanya stood near the front, her arms crossed and her expression stormy, while Mitchell Farnsworth hovered near the council table, his face pale and anxious. At the center of it all stood Sheriff Daniels, his smug confidence radiating as he exchanged nods with Mayor Harrington and a few council members. Ayanna felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to remain composed. This was her moment, and she couldn't afford to falter. As she approached the podium, the room quieted. Daniels turned to face her, his smirk widening, as if he relished the chance to dismantle her publicly. Dr. Morgan, he drawled, I wasn't expecting you tonight. Thought you might be too busy addressing the serious allegations against you. Ayanna held his gaze, unflinching. I'm here because the truth needs to be heard. Truth? Daniels chuckled. You mean your version of it? No, Sheriff, she said evenly. The truth about you. The room gasped as Ayanna pulled out a stack of papers and held them aloft. These documents, she said, her voice ringing out clearly, reveal a pattern of corruption and fraud involving Sheriff Daniels and members of this council. Over the past 5 years, funds meant for public projects have been diverted into private accounts, lining the pockets of those sworn to serve this community. Daniels's smirk froze, his face darkening. This is slander, he snapped. You've got no proof. Oh, but I do, Ayanna countered, spreading the documents on the table before the council. Emails, bank statements, and signed approvals for contracts that were never fulfilled. It's all here. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping as townspeople demanded explanations. Daniel stepped forward, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. You're overstepping, Dr. Morgan, he hissed, his voice low enough for only her to hear. You don't know who you're messing with. No, Sheriff, Ayanna replied, her tone calm but icy. You underestimated who you were messing with. Daniel slammed his hand on the table, silencing the room. This is a baseless attack by someone desperate to cover their own tracks. Ayanna turned to the crowd, her voice rising above the clamor. The only desperation here is from those trying to protect their power. The truth is out now, and I've already sent this evidence to the State Attorney General. This is bigger than me. It's about the future of Millbrook. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, one voice rose from the back. We believe you, Dr. Morgan. It was Tanya, her voice unwavering. Others quickly joined in, their cries of support swelling until the room felt like it might burst. Daniels's composure cracked, his face contorting with fury. Enough! He bellowed, his hand moving instinctively toward his holstered weapon. The room froze. Ayanna's breath caught as she watched him, her heart pounding. For a split second, the world seemed to hang in a precarious balance. Sheriff, stand down, came a voice from the side. Everyone turned to see Deputy Collins, one of Daniel's own men, stepping forward. His hand rested on his own holster, his expression grim. "This has gone far enough, you're out of line." Daniel's hand faltered, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "You don't know what you're doing, Collins," he growled. "I'm doing what's right," the deputy replied. "And what's legal." The tension shattered as Collins stepped closer to Daniels, his presence commanding. The sheriff's hand dropped reluctantly to his side, and the room exhaled as one. Ayanna stepped back to the podium, her voice steady. "The time for intimidation and corruption is over. This town deserves better, and we're not stopping until justice is served." The fallout was swift. By morning, news of the confrontation had spread beyond Millbrook, with state authorities arriving to seize records and begin formal investigations. Daniels was placed on administrative leave, his authority stripped as mounting evidence against him surfaced. Mayor Harrington resigned quietly, his role in the scheme too damning to defend. Ayanna's resolve had sparked something bigger than herself. The community rallied around her, their support growing with each passing day. Mitchell Farnsworth, guilt-ridden and seeking redemption, came forward with additional evidence, solidifying the case against the corrupt officials. But Ayanna knew the fight wasn't over. The systems that allowed people like Daniels to thrive were deeply rooted, and dismantling them would take time. Still, for the first time, she felt hope. Hope that change was possible, even in a town that had tried so hard to resist it. As Ayanna prepared to leave Millbrook for a meeting with state officials, her phone buzzed with an anonymous message. "You may have won this battle, but the war isn't over. Watch your back." Ayanna stared at the screen, her determination hardening. The fight for justice was just beginning. The meeting room buzzed with low murmurs as Ayanna Morgan entered, her shoulders squared, her face calm but resolute. Her arrival silenced the room instantly. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the Millbrook council members, Sheriff Daniels, and a handful of locals. At the head of the long table, Mayor Harrington shuffled papers nervously. To his right sat Daniels, his smirk as sharp as a blade. To his left, Councilman Mitchell Farnsworth avoided eye contact, fidgeting with his pen. Ayanna's eyes swept over the room, noting the tension rippling beneath the surface like an electrical current. She set her briefcase on the table, slowly unclasping it. "Thank you for allowing me to address the council tonight," she began, her voice steady and measured. "I understand there are concerns about my project and my intentions for this community." Daniels leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Concerns would be putting it lightly, Dr. Morgan. Let's not beat around the bush." Ayanna ignored the bait. Instead, she pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the table. "I've brought something to help clarify the situation. These are records from the past 5 years. Documents that show significant discrepancies in public funds meant for Millbrook's infrastructure, schools, and, yes, the clinic." The room shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's smirk faltered for a split second, before returning, sharper than before. "What exactly are you implying, Dr. Morgan?" "I'm not implying anything, Sheriff," Ayanna replied, locking eyes with him. "I'm stating that public funds have been mismanaged, or worse, stolen, by individuals in positions of power." Gasps rippled through the room. Mayor Harrington's face turned pale, and Farnsworth dropped his pen. Daniel's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "You're accusing us of corruption?" Daniels said, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Ayanna's gaze didn't waver. "Yes, I'm talking to a sheriff who's been abusing his position to line his own pockets while silencing anyone who dares challenge him. I'm talking to a council complicit in a system that prioritizes personal gain over the well-being of its people." Daniel shot to his feet, slamming his hands on the table. "Enough of this nonsense. You're grasping at straws, trying to cover your own tracks. You've been under investigation for fraud yourself." "And yet," Ayanna said calmly, pulling another document from her briefcase, "those allegations are baseless, as you well know. Meanwhile, these bank records show direct deposits into accounts linked to you, Sheriff Daniels, and several council members." The room erupted in chaos. Voices overlapped as the council members protested, and townspeople in the audience whispered furiously. Daniel's face twisted into a mask of barely restrained fury. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he snarled, stepping toward her. Coming into my town and stirring up trouble, you have no idea who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Ayanna replied, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. And so does the state attorney general's office. Daniels froze. What did you say? Ayanna held up her phone. All of this evidence has already been sent to state authorities. Investigators are on their way to Millbrook as we speak. The room fell into stunned silence. Daniels' eyes darted to Harrington, who looked like he might faint. Farnsworth buried his face in his hands, mumbling something under his breath. Daniels recovered quickly, his lips curling into a snarl. You're bluffing. Try me, Ayanna said, her tone ice cold. Or better yet, explain to this room why nearly $500,000 meant for public projects is sitting in offshore accounts tied to your name. A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd. Tanya, standing near the back, shouted, We've had enough of your lies, Daniels. The truth is out now. Daniels turned to the room, his voice booming. Don't listen to her. This is a smear campaign, orchestrated by an outsider who doesn't care about Millbrook. Don't you dare, Ayanna said sharply, stepping forward. This outsider has done more for this town in 6 months than you have in your entire career. You've preyed on the people you were supposed to protect. You've intimidated, silenced, and stolen. And now, it's over. The crowd erupted, half in cheers, half in stunned disbelief. Daniel's face reddened with fury. For a moment, it seemed he might lose control entirely. His hand twitched toward his holster, but then he hesitated. Sheriff Daniels, a calm voice interrupted. It was Deputy Collins, stepping forward from the corner of the room. I think it's time you came with me. Daniels whirled on him. What the hell are you doing, Collins? Doing my job, Collins replied evenly. Unlike you. Daniels took a step back, his eyes darting wildly. This is a mistake. You're all making a huge mistake. Maybe, Collins said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs, but it's your turn to answer some questions. The crowd exploded into cheers as Collins approached Daniels, who stiffened but didn't resist. Ayanna watched as the once smug sheriff was led out of the room, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. With Daniels gone, Ayanna turned to the council. This is just the beginning. If you truly care about Millbrook, you'll cooperate fully with the investigation. The people deserve better, and it's time for a change. Farnsworth, visibly shaken, nodded. You're right, he said quietly. We failed this town, but we can make it right. Then start now, Ayanna said firmly. Resign, all of you. Let new leadership guide this town forward. One by one, the council members stood and announced their resignations, their voices heavy with shame. The room erupted once more, the energy shifting from anger to hope. As Ayanna stepped outside, the cool night air hit her face. The crowd outside the town hall was larger now, buzzing with excitement and gratitude. Tanya rushed up to her, pulling her into a tight hug. You did it, Tanya said, her voice thick with emotion. You really did it. Ayanna smiled faintly, but her eyes were distant. Her phone buzzed again, and she pulled it out to see another message. This one was anonymous, and it sent a chill down her spine. You've made powerful enemies watch your back. Ayanna tucked the phone away, her resolve hardening. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with Millbrook's residents, reporters, and representatives from the state attorney general's office. The air buzzed with anticipation, a mix of righteous anger and curiosity, as Sheriff Daniels, now stripped of his badge, sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. Beside him, his attorney shuffled papers nervously, clearly overwhelmed by the damning evidence stacked against his client. Ayanna sat near the front, her presence commanding but calm. This wasn't a victory lap for her. It was justice being served. She had spent months fighting for this moment, enduring harassment, threats, and public scrutiny. Now, the truth was out, and the people of Millbrook were finally seeing the corruption that had plagued their town for years. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bravado gone. His attorney stood to address the court, but the weight of the evidence against him was insurmountable. The prosecutor presented a meticulous case, supported by Ayanna's efforts and Rachel Bryant's investigative reporting emails, bank records, and testimonies from whistleblowers painted a clear picture of Daniels' crimes: embezzlement, intimidation, and abuse of power. By the time the prosecutor rested her case, it was clear that Daniels' reign of corruption was over. The verdict came swiftly. Daniels was found guilty on multiple counts, and the judge sentenced him to a lengthy prison term. The room erupted in applause as he was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed in defeat. Ayanna didn't join in the celebration. Instead, she stood quietly, her mind already turning to what came next. This was a victory. Yes. But it wasn't the end. The systems that allowed someone like Daniels to thrive were still intact, and dismantling them would take more than one trial. The community's healing. The fallout from Daniels' conviction sent shockwaves through Millbrook. Mayor Harrington and the remaining council members resigned in disgrace, leaving room for new leadership to emerge. Tanya, energized by Ayanna's fight, announced her candidacy for mayor, vowing to bring transparency and equity to the town's government. Community members who had been silent for years began to speak up, sharing their own experiences of injustice. Ayanna worked closely with local activists to establish a watchdog group, ensuring that future leaders would be held accountable. The clinic project, once mired in controversy, gained overwhelming support. With Daniels and his allies removed, funding was secured, and construction began. Ayanna oversaw every detail, ensuring that the facility would be a beacon of hope and care for the town. Ayanna's growth. Ayanna sat in her new office at the nearly completed clinic, her gaze drifting out the window to the bustling construction site below. She had changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. The battle with Daniels had tested her limits, forcing her to confront not only systemic corruption, but also her own fears and doubts. For years, she had believed that her credentials and hard work would speak for themselves, that her success would shield her from the biases and barriers others faced. Millbrook had shattered that illusion, but it had also reignited her determination to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Rachel Bryant. The AG's office is launching a statewide investigation into similar cases. Your work started something big. Ayanna smiled faintly. She had always hoped her work could create ripples, but now she saw it creating waves. Systemic change. Millbrook wasn't the only place affected by the revelations. News of the corruption scandal spread across the state, prompting investigations into other small-town officials with unchecked power. Ayanna became a sought-after speaker, sharing her story to inspire communities to hold their leaders accountable. She traveled to towns that reminded her of Millbrook, meeting with residents, activists, and officials who wanted to rebuild trust and reform their systems. Each visit reinforced her belief that change was possible, even in the face of entrenched power. Back in Millbrook, the clinic became a symbol of resilience. Its grand opening drew crowds from across the region, and Ayanna stood at the podium, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. This clinic isn't just about healthcare, she said. It's about hope. It's about a community that refused to let fear and corruption define it. Millbrook has shown that when we stand together, we can overcome anything. The crowd erupted in applause, and Ayanna felt a surge of pride. This was why she fought. This was the change she had envisioned. Emotional closure. That evening, Ayanna returned to her modest rental house on the edge of town. The quiet felt strange after the chaos of the past months, but it was a welcome reprieve. She poured herself a cup of tea and settled into the worn armchair by the window, watching the stars blink into view. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Tanya. We couldn't have done this without you. Thank you for believing in us. Ayanna's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to everyone who had fought alongside her. She looked at the stack of files on her desk, remnants of the battles she had fought and the ones still ahead. There were more towns like Millbrook, more systems that needed dismantling. But tonight, for the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe, to rest. Setting up future possibilities. As Ayanna drifted off to sleep, her phone buzzed one last time. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing as she read the anonymous message. You won this round, but the fight isn't over, we'll be watching. She stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone aside. The words were a reminder that her work was far from finished, but instead of fear, she felt a quiet resolve. Ayanna Morgan had faced worse, and she wasn't about to stop now. The stars stretched endlessly across the Millbrook sky, their quiet brilliance a stark contrast to the turmoil that had gripped the town for so long. Ayanna Morgan sat on the front steps of the clinic, now fully built and bustling with activity, and let the crisp evening air fill her lungs. She had fought countless battles in her life, but none had felt as transformative as this one. Millbrook had challenged her in ways she hadn't anticipated, forcing her to confront not just external adversaries, but also her own doubts and vulnerabilities. Looking back, Ayanna knew she had changed. She had always been resilient. Her career as a neurosurgeon and CEO had demanded it. But Millbrook had taught her a deeper kind of strength. It wasn't just about enduring hardship or pushing through adversity. It was about standing firm in the face of systemic injustice, about refusing to back down even when the odds seemed insurmountable. This fight had reminded her of the power of community. She had arrived in Millbrook as an outsider, armed with plans and data, believing that logic and goodwill would be enough to spark change. But it was the people, the activists like Tanya, the hesitant allies like Mitchell Farnsworth, and the ordinary residents who had stepped forward, that had transformed her vision into reality. They had reminded her that true change required more than strategy. It required heart, courage, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of something better, a personal fight. Reflecting broader struggles. Ayanna's battle in Millbrook wasn't unique. It was a microcosm of struggles happening across the country, where marginalized voices were too often silenced by entrenched systems of power. Daniels had been more than just an individual antagonist. He had been a symbol of a much larger problem. A justice system that protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. A culture that resisted change because it threatened the status quo. The revelations about Daniels and the council had sent shockwaves through the state, leading to investigations in other towns and sparking a broader conversation about corruption and accountability. Ayanna had been inundated with calls and messages from people who had faced similar battles, many of whom saw her as an inspiration. She didn't take that lightly. She knew that her victory in Millbrook wasn't the end of the fight, but a spark for something larger. Her story was a reminder that systemic problems couldn't be solved by one person alone. It took collective effort, solidarity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. And while the work was exhausting, it was also deeply rewarding. Each small victory, each step forward, was a reminder of what was possible. Hope and progress. The clinic had become a tangible symbol of hope for Millbrook. Its opening had drawn residents from across the town, many of whom had been skeptical of Ayanna at first. Now, they saw the fruits of her labor, a place where families could receive care, where children could be vaccinated, and where seniors could find comfort and dignity in their later years. But the clinic wasn't just a building. It was a promise Ayanna had worked tirelessly to ensure that its services were accessible to everyone, regardless of income or background. She had recruited local staff, creating jobs, and building trust within the community. The clinic's success wasn't just a win for healthcare. It was a testament to what could be achieved when people came together with a shared purpose. Beyond Millbrook, Ayanna had become a voice for change. She traveled to other towns, sharing her story and working with communities to identify and address their own challenges. Her experiences had taught her that progress was slow and often painful, but it was also possible. Each conversation, each connection, was a step toward dismantling the systems that perpetuated inequality. Ayanna's growth. For Ayanna, this journey had been deeply personal. She had faced not only external challenges, but also moments of profound self-doubt. There had been nights when she questioned whether her efforts were worth it, whether she was making a difference, or simply beating her head against an immovable wall. But every time she saw a child smile at the clinic, every time a resident thanked her for her work, she was reminded of why she had started this fight. She had also learned to let others in. Ayanna had always prided herself on her independence, but Millbrook had shown her the power of collaboration. Tanya's fierce activism, Mitchell's reluctant courage, and Rachel Bryant's relentless pursuit of the truth had all been critical to their success. Ayanna had learned to lean on others, to trust in their strengths, and to build something greater together. Her personal growth wasn't just about resilience. It was about transformation. She had entered Millbrook as a skilled professional, with a vision she left as a leader, someone who understood the complexities of systemic change and the importance of humility, empathy, and perseverance. A call to action. As Ayanna looked out at the quiet streets of Millbrook, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction, but she also knew there was more work to be done. The fight against corruption, prejudice, and inequality was far from over. It was a fight that would take generations to win, but Ayanna was determined to do her part. Her message to others was simple. Progress is possible, but it requires action. It requires ordinary people to stand up, to speak out, and to demand better. Ayanna hoped her story would inspire others to take that first step, to challenge the systems that seemed unchangeable, and to believe in the power of collective effort. Change starts small, she often said in her speeches. It starts with one voice, one action, one moment of courage, and when those moments come together, they create a movement. Closing reflections. As the stars shone brighter, Ayanna stood and stretched, feeling the weight of the day begin to lift. The anonymous threat she'd received still lingered in her mind, a reminder that her work came with risks. But instead of fear, she felt a quiet determination. She walked back into the clinic, its lights warm and inviting against the night. Inside, she could hear the hum of activity, nurses preparing for the next day, patients checking in for evening appointments. It was a small but powerful reminder of what she had accomplished. As she stood in the doorway, Ayanna allowed herself a moment of pride. Millbrook had tried to break her, but she had stood firm. She had faced corruption, prejudice, and intimidation, and she had come out stronger. More importantly, she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for an entire community. Her story wasn't over. There were more battles to fight, more voices to uplift, and more systems to change. But tonight, Ayanna Morgan allowed herself to rest, knowing that she had taken the first step toward a better future. Ayanna's journey is a testament to the power of resilience and collective action. Her fight reminds us that while systemic injustice may seem insurmountable, progress is possible when we refuse to give up. Her story isn't just hers. It belongs to everyone who has ever dared to stand against inequality and demand something better. Let this story inspire you to take action, to believe in change, and to fight for justice wherever it's needed. Because together, we can build a world where fairness and equity prevail. The end, for now.